This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sellers Resource, which is a new resource I've created for Etsy sellers. To learn more about this, please listen to the end of the episode where I will share more information about the Sellers Resource.
Welcome to the Etsy Conversations podcast, featuring inspiring interviews with Etsy shop owners, hosted by Ijama Elazu.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Etsy Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Ijama, and I thank you for joining me for another episode. And this week I have a returning guest, but we're talking about something new. My guest is Lesley Hayes, and you will remember that I spoke with Lesley back in December of 2017, and we were talking all about Google Analytics and just understanding your Etsy shop analytics in general. Well, Lesley is back again, and we're talking about something really important that you as a seller cannot afford to ignore or disregard. It's if you don't pay attention to it, it's going to happen anyway. And so that's where we're having this conversation to help get you educated and informed about what you need to know with regard to GDPR. If you haven't heard of GDPR yet, this will be a good primer for you. And Lesley, thank you so much for being my guest, and welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back, Ijama.
You're welcome. Now, you've actually been busy since we last spoke. You launched your new community, and you were also part of the Makers Biz Summit this 2018.
Yes. Deb had me on to speak about Google Analytics at the summit, and it was really fun. It was really great. And starting to build that data-driven makers community, especially around a lot of the people that were in the summit. So it's been really fun.
Oh, yes, that's good. Congratulations on all that. And I got so much good feedback about the Maker Summit in general. So I know it must have been, so good to be a part of a program that was so helpful to sellers in so many ways.
It was amazing. A little bit starstruck, actually, some of the other speakers that were there. And I get to be a speaker with them.
Right, yeah. Now, Lesley's website is Artisan Analytics. I will link to Lesley's website so you can check it out. And you can also get information at artisananalytics.com.au to see how you can join her community as well. So, Lesley, we're talking today about GDPR and what that stands for anyone who doesn't yet know, is General Data Protection Regulation. And this is something that, as I mentioned before, affects all of us as sellers. But Lesley has done a lot more reading about this than I have. And I was telling her every time I try to sit down to try and figure it all out so that I can share that information with you, my eyes glaze over. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation, and we're going to talk about what that is, why it affects you, and how, and also go over the forum discussion that was held by TJ Parks on May 1st, 2018. TJ Parks is Etsy's Data Protection, Compliance, and Privacy Officer, and he was responding to questions in the forum. So if you haven't had a chance to look those over, we'll touch on some of what was covered, the questions that were asked, and his responses. But before we do that, we have some housekeeping to do, and we'll start with a disclaimer. Lesley?
All right. So this is a legal topic, and I'm not a lawyer, so nothing that I talk about today is legal advice, and our listeners have to make their own decisions about what they pay attention to and what they implement in their own businesses. And if they need to seek legal advice, then they need to do that before, taking any particular action. So that's it. That's out of the way.
Okay. And I'm not a lawyer, as you will very easily be able to tell as we have this conversation. So, again, also anything I say is not and should not be construed as legal advice. Consult with a lawyer, like Lesley said. Neither of us are lawyers. We're just talking about this topic and sharing information with you, just to make you aware. And then you can go and do some more homework if you need to. And so before we start, Lesley, so this conversation isn't just about GDPR. What is it?
No, so the GDPR is new European Union requirements that will be put into law by the various EU countries. But some of the stuff, in fact, a lot of the stuff that's in it is already in privacy laws of other countries. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's gotten a lot of media attention. And so suddenly people are realizing, oh, I need a privacy policy. I need to do this. I need to do that.
Yeah.
But they actually might have already had those requirements. So it's not totally new.
Yes.
But it's also not just about following the law. Because of the media attention that it's been getting, people whose data is being collected, which is you and me and our customers, we're becoming more aware of what's going on. And we've had the Facebook fiasco and people are worried. Mm-hmm. So even if the particular laws don't apply to you, maybe your customers think that they should, or think that you have certain obligations. So it's almost a bit of a competitive advantage or a requirement from a customer service point of view.
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned that some of what is covered are laws and regulations that have been in effect prior to this. Even on Etsy, I know that with the seller's resource, some of the topics that I covered that affect customers in the EU, sellers in the US and outside of the EU are required to abide by those regulations. And these are things that you might not be aware of, and which, if anything should happen, you would still be accountable, because as someone who is doing e-commerce with people who reside in certain locations, you're required to stick to their rules, and the onus is on you to know what those rules are and then stick to them. So that's what we're going to try and help you be aware of today. So, Lesley, where do we begin?
All right. So I was thinking we'll go through the Etsy Forum Q&A. We'll go through the questions that TJ answered, because they pretty much cover all the major things that buyers need or sellers need to be aware of. But before we start, I'll just preface, we're going to be talking about some terms and concepts that are new to people. I'll try to define them as I go along, but sometimes we'll just need to wait until afterwards.
Okay.
Or it might even be something that I'll point towards a resource later.
Okay. Sounds good. Before we start, can we start with and I don't know if this was going to be your top thing to define, but I know I mentioned earlier that GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. But can we start with just a basic understanding of what that is and why we should care?
Absolutely. So the most important new thing that this regulation puts in place is what's called data subject rights. And a data subject is anyone whose data has been collected. So you're a data subject and I'm a data subject when our data has been collected and used by anyone. Mm-hmm. And under the regulation, subjects will have rights to do things that they haven't had rights to do before, like ask for their data to be completely deleted, not just deactivated or unsubscribed, but wiped off servers. That's brand new. And it just reiterates other things like the fact that you can download it. So a lot of people will have noticed that you can now go and download all your information from Facebook. You can also download all your information from Google. To request that your information is edited if it's wrong, to be able to opt out, that kind of thing. So there are a list of them, but for the most part, what we need to worry about is just making sure that the tools that we use support them. We don't need to necessarily act on them.
Okay.
The other main things are about why you store or collect the data. So you have to have a lawful reason to do so. And there are three main reasons that we would have, which is contract. So we have to have the information to fulfill a contract, which in most cases is fulfilling a sale, or that we have got consent to use it. So that's around marketing. And then there's another one called legitimate interest, which is kind of a wishy-washy one, but I do talk about it a little bit because it is an option if you pay attention to how you're using it. Those are the main differences that I see, or the main things that people need to be aware of that are included in it.
Okay. And so this regulation that we're talking about takes effect on May 25th of 2018. Is there anything that as sellers we need to actively do prior to or on that day, like, flipping a switch, or do we need to prepare? How far in advance do we need to prepare, or is it something that we need to do from May 25th going forward?
Ready on that. I mean, the reality is that nobody's going to be on May 26th, but you should be ready on May 25th with everything that you need to only sell on Etsy. You don't have that many things to take care of. We'll be talking a bit about privacy policies.
Okay.
So every seller will need to have their own policy. And apart from that, there might not be anything else that you really need to do. You might also want to look at how you are getting opt-ins if you have an email marketing list. That might be another thing to have a look at.
Okay. And then as far as privacy policies go, that Etsy for our shop, for seller shops, Etsy has a policy template that sellers can use. Do sellers need to have unique policies that are different from others, or is it still okay to use the template that Etsy offers as a what do I call it? As a jumping off point?
Are you talking about the privacy policy one in particular?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you should definitely have a look at that one. It's called How to Write an On-Point Privacy Policy in the handbook.
Yes.
But you also need to audit everything that you collect and make sure that you've talked about all of it in your privacy policy.
Okay.
So you might not need everything that's in their example. You might need things that aren't in their example, and be clear for yourself what's what before you go and copy paste anything.
Okay. And I will link to the article in the seller handbook about how to write an on-point policy. And there are actually a few resources that we'll probably mention along the way, but even if we don't, I will link to them as well, because TJ mentioned them and linked to them. And so you should read them and check them out. So can we jump into the Q&A?
Yeah.
Let's start with, whose question or what question do you want to start with? Some of them were very similar, so they were grouped into
I think we
sections.
talk about the big one, the big elephant in the room that everyone was worried about, which was not being able to see buyer email addresses.
Yes.
That was probably about 80% of the questions was,
yes,
has Etsy considered why we use this? It's actually really important and we need it for shipping and all sorts of stuff. So TJ had a couple of specific questions in there, but they were all pretty similar, and sellers raised really valid reasons that they need email addresses. And he was able to say that Etsy won't be removing buyer emails on May 25th, that they've changed that, and that they're going to be implementing some new tools first to make sure that we can effectively communicate with buyers through Etsy before they remove it.
Yes.
I wonder whether that will still be sufficient for people who need email addresses for courier companies. But if Etsy give us a masked address like eBay uses, we would be able to put that into our shipping tools.
Right. And I know one of the concerns that, well, I shouldn't say it was a concern, but it was a comment that somebody shared in the forums was, as a buyer, she expressed that she didn't like being automatically added to mailing lists, which some sellers do, and really you're not supposed to, at least not in the US.
No.
I'm not sure what the regulations are outside of the US, but really you're not supposed to just lift someone's email address and then add them to your mailing list. And I know that has happened to me before, because then I start to get these mailings and I'm like, who is this person and how did they get my email address? That's not allowed. And so she was saying, I thought it was interesting that she said as a buyer, she doesn't like being automatically added to mailing lists, but as a seller, she likes to know what people's emails addresses are, more so for communication if they're not responding to Etsy convos. But then there's also value in actually asking people to join your email list. Now, will that change once Etsy makes whatever changes they're going to with regard to transparency of our buyers' emails? Will we still be able to ask people to voluntarily sign up to our newsletters? And is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. So we've never been able to add them automatically, as far as I know, because of the Etsy terms. If people have added you to their email marketing list and you didn't explicitly opt in, I would be flagging that as spam. Do it enough and it will eventually affect them. So if we aren't able to see the email address, of course we can still ask them to voluntarily opt in by sending them a link to our sign up form.
Yes.
But you have to be careful about that as well. You can't say, or you shouldn't send them a separate convo to ask them to do that. You should be including it in like a convo or a thank you message or something that you're sending them about the transaction.
Oh, okay.
So otherwise it's like an unsolicited communications
Yes.
by itself.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And that's against the policy.
Yeah. So big companies have actually gotten in a lot of trouble for that. Sending quite recently, I think, it might have even been, no, I can't remember the company. It was a big company. They sent out a mass email asking people if they wanted to stay subscribed, trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But the people who they sent that email to hadn't opted in to anything at all. And so they got fined quite a lot.
Yeah. And I find that annoying because I've received emails like that, not asking me if I want to be subscribed, but received emails that were not solicited. And then when I go to unsubscribe, it says sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes there will be a survey that says, do you mind telling us why you're unsubscribing? And I've said in those cases, not always, but when that is the case, I never subscribed to receive these mailings. But I wonder if the people who own those lists actually look at that and if that affects anything they do. You know, like, does it make a difference if one or two people say, look, I never even asked for these. That's why I don't want to be on the list. Or do they just keep on doing what they're doing? Is there a better way to make sure they stop just adding people randomly who have not asked to be on the list?
So there are two things you can do. You can flag it as spam within your email system, and that will make that the server that sends that email, it will start to have a poor reputation if enough people do it. And that's not good for anyone, especially other people who are trying to send emails using that same platform. But when you fill out that survey at the end, that makes me think that it's through MailChimp. That sounds really familiar.
Oh.
And I suspect that what MailChimp does is that if people are getting responses with things like that they've never subscribed, that this is spam, that kind of thing, I think it would eventually flag it with MailChimp itself, and they could take action against that person's account. They probably need a lot before they did, because it'll happen to everyone occasionally. People forget that they subscribed. But yeah,
that's true
definitely.
too.
If a lot of people did it, it would flag something.
Yeah. And sometimes I worry about that too, because I've said this, before on the podcast, that I'm not always good about communicating with people who sign up to my mailing list. And when there's been a lag in communication and I send something out, I always have that fear and some slight trepidation that somebody is going to forget that they actually signed up and then get something from me and be like, whoa, who are you and why is this coming in, and then flag me as spam. So
yeah, it's actually a big risk. I know people start building their list. Maybe they're only just starting their shop and they're at a market and they're getting people to sign up there, but they don't know how they're going to use them, and they don't get around to using them until 6 months later. That can be a risk there, that people don't remember where they signed up, and it is actually something to, try to take into consideration.
Yeah.
So when you get an email, try to use it reasonably quickly.
Yes, that's a good point.
But of course, if you have proper record of the consent and where you got it, then from a legal standpoint, you're totally fine.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk next about using customer data outside of Etsy. What's this about becoming a data controller?
So a data controller is defined in the GDPR as someone who controls what gets collected and what it's used for and where it goes. Okay. So most of the time, Etsy is the data controller. So when someone signs up, a buyer signs up for Etsy, their relationship is with Etsy. If they want to delete their account, their details under their data subject right, they go to Etsy and ask, not you.
Okay.
But if you take your transaction information, including their buyer information, and you put it into your accounting software or your shipping tool, then you're the data controller now. So if the buyer comes to you and says, I bought something off you and I want to download, I want access to all the information you have on me, then you can say, well, you need to go to Etsy directly to get your Etsy information, but I need to download all the information I have on this person out of my accounting or shipping or any other kinds of tools that I've transferred their transaction details into. And that's also your email marketing system. So if you've asked them to sign up, you're the data controller for their data going into MailChimp or Aweber or whatever you use.
And so who is policing that? Like if somebody asks for their data to be removed, and I've exported information outside of Etsy to share with a courier or added them to an email marketing list that I have, if they ask me to do it, who is going to check that and make sure that I do it? And I guess this is more a concern for the consumer. Who's protecting their information? Because what if I forget, or I say I will and I don't, or maybe not me, but a vendor says they will and they don't? How does a consumer, and at some point we're all consumers, so this isn't just,
absolutely.
How
so each country in the EU has their own data authority. So depending on where that person lives, they could go to that authority to complain or to check up on you, or whatever they need to do.
Okay. Do you know of a resource that has a list of the different agencies that consumers can verify with or report to in case a vendor doesn't delete their data when it's requested?
Um, I haven't actually looked up a list. No.
Okay.
I know that I'm pretty sure that for the UK, for example, it's the Information Commissioner's Office,
Okay.
but we can certainly get one and put it in the notes
Okay.
for
All
the
right.
show.
Okay, great. That would be great because I would assume somebody listening would like to know how to confirm that, or
Mm.
just know what who to go to in the event that they need to report something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so next, now you had you had your question answered, which when I saw that I was like, whoa, they picked Lesley's question. So what did you ask and what did TJ say?
All right. So of course I asked a really technical question. I wanted to know when our Google Analytics cookies and any other kinds of cookies that might be getting used by like advertising things that we've turned on in Etsy, when they're put onto the visitor's browser, what kind of consent is Etsy going to ask? Because this is another requirement. It's actually not under the GDPR, it's under the e-privacy directive, which is runs alongside the GDPR, and it talks about in this case, it talks about the technology side of it. So
Okay.
putting cookies, and if you're not familiar with cookies, they're just little bits of text that sit in your browser on your computer. Send. And whether, what they would ask when they were getting consent, because that might affect what different features using Google Analytics. Now, TJ confirmed that we would need to reference this in our privacy policy, which is definitely the case.
Yes.
He didn't say anything about the consent, but luckily I'd also emailed Etsy a couple of weeks ago, and Casey from their legal team had replied to me, which was really awesome.
Nice.
And she said that when they ask for consent for our Google Analytics code, it'll be under consent for personalized advertising. So that kind of means that a lot of your EU visitors might not consent to your Google Analytics code running, right? So if you have a lot of EU visitors, you might see that number drop off, but you might, in fact, you'll probably see it stay the same in shop stats, because that would come under a different consent level.
Interesting.
So that'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah. Okay.
But luckily it means that we can leave features turned on in GA that I've encouraged people on my blog to use. So demographics, if you've ever turned that on, and remarketing lists. So you can safely continue to use those two features out of Google Analytics, because Etsy is asking for the right consent for you to use them. So that was good.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. So
yep, technical question.
Yeah, of course. Trust you. So technically, it's possible. Well, historically, Etsy stats and Google Analytics numbers have never really actually truly matched up. But there's always been some disparity between the two. So now, are you saying that it's possible that disparity might be even more glaring?
If it works like I understand it will work from what the legal team told me, then yes, what you will probably see is visits from European countries drop off considerably in Google Analytics, but not drop off in shop stats. And that's just assuming that people don't want to consent to that, but maybe they do. Maybe they'll all be like, yes, you can send me personalized based on what I do in your shop.
Okay.
We'll wait and find out.
Yeah. All right. And then just to touch on privacy policies again, this is huge. This is something that for a while you've said it on your blog before. people need to have a privacy policy, but you also have some suggestions about what is required and why in a privacy policy. Can we talk about that?
Yes. So I've suggested it before because when you turn on these features that I've recommended, like demographics, Google in their terms requires you to put certain things in your privacy policy. And they weren't referenced at all in Etsy's privacy policy. So I thought that we should be putting it in ours to make it super clear.
Okay.
So I've had some recommended text on my blog for a while, but it only talked about those things. Now we need to have a full privacy policy that talks about every bit of data that we collect, that's coming out of Etsy, not the stuff that's in Etsy, and what we do with it, why we collect it, and a few other things. So I would recommend that, again, people go and look at that privacy policy article on the Seller's Handbook. I'd also recommend that you do a quick Google and look for GDPR policy checklists. They're out there, and reading it will make it a lot easier than just listening to me list it out. The first step in being able to write a privacy policy is understanding what you need to put in it. And to do that, you need to audit the data that you collect and use. And I know audit sounds like some sort of big, confusing, long process to go through.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be a good opportunity for you to clarify to yourself what you're doing. Are you opening your buyers up to any security risks? Can you actually ask for less data? Can you, tighten things up and maybe not ask for certain things for certain situations? So the questions that you need to ask is, how do you collect data? And you should list out all the different things that your buyers or visitors or contacts, so they're not necessarily just people that buy from you, but everyone who comes into contact with your business and that you collect their data from, what are they doing when you're collecting that data? So they might be visiting your shop, which is Google Analytics, or if you're using the Facebook retargeting, they're putting the Facebook pixel on with the beta feature, that would be one, or Google Shopping ads. Are they signing up to your MailChimp list through a link that you've sent them? And of course, making a purchase, because you can see their information when they make a purchase. And then why do you collect it? Is it to fulfill the sale and actually send them what they ask for, or to send them marketing, or just to have a look at anonymous usage of your shop? And then you should ask yourself, do you really need it? You probably don't have that many complicated things on a simple Etsy shop, but you should ask this question anyway. Can you ask for less? So if you have a really long email newsletter sign up form that asks for lots of different things, maybe you don't need them all. And then from there, you can decide what your lawful basis is for collecting each of this piece of information, because you need to put that in your privacy policy. So I'll include some links in the show notes to some more information about them so that you can get a really good understanding of what they mean before you decide that you're going to use them.
Okay.
You also need to know what happens if they don't give you that information. Does it stop you from being able to send them what they bought? Because that, obviously that's mandatory then.
Yeah.
Or is it optional? And you should list out what tools and services or systems you use to enable you to collect this data.
Okay.
So your marketing system or your system, or if you're just using a spreadsheet on your computer down. At that point, you need to do a little bit more Googling and look up those and GDPR. Look for their information page about how they're being compliant, and they'll should tell you everything you need to know. Are they a controller or a processor? If they're just then you're the controller, and you definitely need to put them in your privacy policy. Where is their data stored? If it's in the United States, you need to make sure that they're covered by something called the Privacy Shield, which is an agreement between the United States and the EU that allows European data to be transferred, or information about European citizens to be transferred to the United States. handful of other countries that are actually allowed to store people in the EU. So you need to be careful there. And then double check that they have the tools and features you need to let data subjects access, download, edit, or delete their data. A lot of the time, this will be listed on the GDPR information page that they have, because these will be new tools. They had to scramble to let you, delete things for real, like I said.
Yeah.
And you should also, so coming back from the particular tool and back to why you've collected the data and what you've collected, do you share this data with anyone else? So if you enter shipping information directly into, say, FedEx's website when you're doing label making, you might not have put that down as a tool, but it's still someone who you're sharing it with. So this is just capturing that, but also employees, staff, family, if they help out, who has access to the information that you're collecting. Can you lock that down? This is an opportunity to, again, tighten up who you're sharing data with.
Okay.
And then finally, how long do you store it? And sometimes there are legal requirements for how long you need to keep, say, transaction data for tax purposes. So you can just say, as long as legally required. That's a pretty good out.
Yeah.
As long as you don't actually store it longer than is legally required.
Yeah.
And at the end you delete it. So as long as I need to give you the service, as long as it's legally required, or as long as you stay on my mailing list, I'll keep it. Those are pretty good ways of describing that if you don't have a specific time. So like I said, if you can go and find a checklist for that, I will also have an article about privacy policies that will reiterate these questions. It'll be a lot easier to sort of just jump through those questions and fill out a quick little data audit. Once you've got all that information, that's your privacy policy. That's it. So you just write that all up in some way that's really easy to understand. It's really clear to people what you're doing. Just use normal English or whatever your preferred language is that you need to write it in. And that's it.
Easy as pie.
Make it simple. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions.
What's important to understand so that people don't freak out about this is that it's all about showing that you are trying to do it right. So if you don't get it perfect the first time, it's not really a problem as long as you're honestly trying to do what you thought you needed to do, and you can show that you are intending to comply.
Okay.
That's it. That's all it takes.
Okay. All right. That's encouraging. But
yes.
that just the fact that if we can demonstrate we're trying to do the right thing, even if we don't get it, exactly right by, whatever legal standards, there's a good faith goes into helping to protect us. Just the fact that we're trying in good faith to do the right thing. But I do have some questions.
There are warnings and things like that. Like, it's not like suddenly you're hit with these huge fines out of the blue.
Yeah.
There's a whole communications and warning and support process that would go on before you got that.
Oh, okay. Good. So let's say I'm a seller and all I do is sell my vintage items or my handmade items or supplies on Etsy. That's all I do. I don't have a mailing list. I don't communicate outside of the Convo system. I don't use stamps.com or FedEx or anything other than just, Etsy shipping. Okay, FedEx is built into Etsy shipping, but, I just use Etsy to post my wares and sell my wares. What's the minimum requirement or what do I still need to go through all of this if Etsy has their own policy on the website? Am I still considered my own individual unit, if you will?
It's a tricky one, actually, because if you're taking their data and putting it into another system, even just into a spreadsheet, then it's really obvious. But I don't know, if you're just getting an email about a transaction, is that are you the controller for that email? I wouldn't think so, and I actually don't know the answer to that. So
Okay.
what I would do is, if you don't use any other systems to handle shipping and you don't store their data in anywhere for accounting purposes,
Yeah.
then I would go with the example text on the Etsy privacy policy.
Okay.
Because under the information I collect section, it just talks about, you provide me with some information which Etsy authorized to provide me, and I just do it to fulfill your order. In fact, I would probably go with what they have given, because if you're running a business, you probably should be keeping a copy of this information, just for your own sake, to prove that you got these transactions, for, if there's any legal disputes, which is something that they mentioned in theirs, you need to be able to access that information, and that's why you're keeping it.
Okay.
So I reckon you could just go with selecting some of the stuff from their example one,
Okay.
but you could ignore stuff about third parties.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Were there any other questions that TJ responded to that we haven't yet talked about that you think are important to mention and review?
I didn't really think so. There were definitely other questions that were sort of just general questions, maybe about what Etsy was doing. There was a question about data storage, which looks important for your privacy policy,
Yeah.
but actually it's important to know that you don't need to put anything in your privacy policy about how Etsy is storing stuff.
Okay.
So remember that your buyer has a completely separate relationship with them. So it doesn't matter. You don't need to say that you're transferring stuff to Etsy,
Okay.
on how long they keep it, because you're not. You're getting it from Etsy.
Okay.
There wasn't really anything else.
Okay. All right. So it kind of doesn't sound as intimidating as, initially it sounded when, me or somebody listening right now first heard, this GDPR and you need to know this now because it's going to affect you. So what's the, if any, first or next step that a seller who's listening right now needs to do, or at least be aware of? What's the big takeaway after this episode ends? What should that person listening do next?
You should do a data audit.
Okay.
Might take you 5 minutes, but you should do it. Keep it in a document somewhere.
Okay.
And then the next step out of that is to do your privacy policy.
Okay. All right.
Or to make any changes that you might make from your data audit. You might decide to change how you do stuff. But data audit, number one.
Okay. All right. And I know you're working on a series that goes into more depth about GDPR over on your blog. How can people find that and go and get more information or connect with you and ask questions if there's something else that they have a question about that we might not have touched on in our conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been releasing what started out as a mini course to my current data-driven makers subscribers. And it's, of course, as you can imagine, become quite big. It's definitely not mini. Trying to condense everything that's out there about this topic into something that's actually useful and not overly complicated to understand. That is all going to go on my blog. In fact, it'll probably be up when this goes out, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes.
Okay.
So definitely go and check that out. It's going to cover all the key things that you need to worry about, whether you sell on Etsy or not.
Okay.
So if you have your own website as well, there are some other things that you might need to have a look at. Okay. They're all going to be in those articles. And so then if you have any questions, definitely leave comments, or you can contact me on my website if you have something more specific.
And again, that's artisananalytics.com.au. Don't forget the .au. or you won't get there. And Lesley, how can someone who wants to get involved in your community and become a part of that, how can someone link up with you or get involved or, sign up to be part of your community that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. So on my website, there's a Get Started page, which is my Google Analytics for Makers course. It's a totally free course. And part of that is you are invited to come and join our Facebook group.
Okay.
So that is how you join up. If you are on my list for the course and you submit a join request, I'll approve you and you'll be able to come in.
Okay. I will link to that as well. So you can connect with Lesley that way, join her Facebook group, and in the future, then you'll be in front of all this and you won't have to wait for the podcast to hear about it. Lesley, thank you so much for coming on and just helping to demystify, this thing that seems so ominous and that's heading towards us. But, thank you for making it, more digestible and more understandable and giving us some steps that we can actually follow and do just to help make sure that we are getting compliant and doing the right thing as sellers and for our customers too.
Thank you. Not a problem. I hope it has been demystifying. It's very easy to dive into the rabbit hole and start worrying about all these things that maybe you don't need to worry about. And of course, people should realize that I'm going into all the really nitty-gritty or the absolute requirements because I don't ever want to tell you that you don't need to do something that you're legally required to do. But of course, people have to make their own decision about what is right for their business and what they want to do to put this into practice.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I agree. Like I said, if you go to convome.com for the show notes for this episode, I will have links to what we've discussed in the article and also links to the articles that with additional information that TJ also mentioned so that you can go and read up and educate yourself and get familiar with what you need to know to stay compliant. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. Thanks again to Lesley for being my guest. Lesley, will you come back again?
Oh, absolutely, Ijama.
Okay. Thank you. I hope you found that conversation with Lesley helpful. One of the things I mentioned in our conversation was a resource or something I created for subscribers to the Seller's Resource about policies that regard sellers who do business with residents of the EU. That's the type of information that I share in the Seller's Resource. These are all audio recordings with information and tips about how to sell on Etsy. I walk you step by step through things that you might have to do in your Etsy shop if it involves setup in your shop, and then also informational recordings about just things you need to know as a seller, both from Etsy but also outside of Etsy. And you can get more information about the Seller's Resource at thesellersresource.com. And I will also have a link in the show notes for this episode. And you can read more information about just what's included in that resource. Again, it's thesellersresource.com. And I thank you for listening to the podcast. I will be back next week.
Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, and while you're there, please leave a review too. Visit convome.com to leave a comment or feedback on this episode.